So I'm just going to pick out a few highlights of the year that are bothering us in engineering. And the first of one is, of course, the post-18 funding review. When this was announced, I think it was the Education Secretary, Damien Hines, suggested that courses that are more expensive to run should be charged more to students. Now, that's a really clever idea when you think about high-cost subjects like engineering being critical to the industrial strategy. So there's a little bit of disconnect in government that needs addressing here. And so we are working through the Academy and through the engineering professional institutions to help support thinking on the post-18 funding review. There are multiple elements to the funding review. We have questions about the student loan system as it currently runs, and the Migration Advisory Committee just released its report on international students, and it upheld Theresa May's decision to keep international students in the migration statistics of the country, which means that there's going to be an inflation of the migration data. And so against many of the higher education community's wishes, and in fact most of the cabinet, it looks like international students will remain in the migration statistics. And then we have the introduction of degree apprenticeships and part-time study and so on, and how that's going to affect the post-18 funding review. This week on Monday, the Engineering Professors Council launched its review, its report into degree apprenticeships for engineering, with around about 50 recommendations to government and the Institute for Apprenticeships and so on. So a very detailed document looking at all the many different elements of degree apprenticeships. And one of the key things that came up was around the cost of apprenticeships, the need for the higher education, academics, engineering departments to go and do visits to companies where these degree apprentices are. An apprenticeship is, of course, a job with training. So it's first and foremost a job. It's an employee under contract with an employer and with a university as well. So there's a three-way contract in effect. So if a student doesn't turn up for lessons at 9 o'clock in the morning, well, they just kind of, people shrug their shoulders. But if it's their loss. But if an employee doesn't turn up for work on at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning, then actually there's an issue, there's an employment issue in terms of them delivering their contractual obligations. So apprenticeships are jobs with training. Now, what that looks like for universities still needs to be thought out. There are some degree apprenticeships in engineering already. Whether there'll be degree apprenticeships in civil engineering and structural engineering is to be seen. I don't think there are any yet. There are. So you just started, okay. So, and in Warwick, yes, indeed. Actually, okay, so there's loads. And in fact, now I recall that we've, stupid me, we've funded Warwick University to do a piece of research on teaching and learning for degree apprentices. So yeah, I should keep my mouth shut. But the fact is that degree apprenticeships are a new form of teaching and learning provision. Many employers are seeing significant benefits for having apprentices over graduates. They think that actually they are embedded in the culture of the workplace at a much earlier age. They understand the needs of the business much earlier on. And I do think we're on the cusp of a kind of quite major shift for graduate engineering and professional engineering. And I do think we may see a shift from graduate training programs, which are typically run after 3 years, to companies, major companies certainly, putting more degree apprentices on, particularly as they're paying into the into the apprenticeship levy at 3% of their staff salaries in total. So, for example, Jaguar Land Rover is right now paying £600,000 per month into the apprenticeship levy. Now, that's a huge number of apprentices they need to start employing in order to recoup that kind of money. Now, of course, they are looking at pushing that out into their supply chain, and so that their supply chain tier 1, tier 2 companies can take on apprenticeships, and they're overtraining for their supply chain as well. But nevertheless, that means that they're less likely. They want to encourage more people to do degree apprenticeships with them rather than taking on graduate training programs, or certainly turning those graduate training programs into M-level degree apprenticeships and things like that. So I do think we're going to see quite a lot of change here. Okay, so post-18 funding review is ongoing, but there are a whole range of reforms that are going to affect that. The next one is our friend Teff. So the first year of Teff was last year, and various universities were awarded bronze, silver and gold. We're moving now to a subject level Teff, and the Department for Education been working on what a subject is. It turns out there are 35 subjects in the Teff, and they'll be grouped into 7 subject groupings. So engineering will be all the engineering disciplines wrapped together. Now this matters because the civil engineering department in a university might be entirely different in the way it teaches, in the way the employment outcomes are in terms of the quality of teaching and learning, compared to the aeronautics department, compared to the electronics department, and so on and so forth. And in fact, in some universities, they might be in different faculties as well. So this issue of subjects is going to matter more and more, I think, for engineering. And actually, when you're looking at the kind of more consolidated groupings, there are 7 subject groupings. So engineering is wrapped in with computing and technology subjects as well, which will include metallurgy and polymer science and things like that. So we're still kind of grappling with how universities are going to present these subject groupings. And we may see, because of these groupings, we may see an increased move towards more general degrees with specialisms so that they can capture more data. And this matters again for students, because the whole purpose of Teff is about informing students of the higher education institutions and the subjects that they're going into. So if you wrap engineering as a single subject, then students are going to have less information about whether the civil engineering degree in that particular university is any better than a civil engineering degree elsewhere. Now, of course, there are other things in the Teff, the quality of the libraries and the general employment outcomes, the quality of the accommodation, all those things are wrapped in an institutional level Teff. But it's going to be very difficult for individuals to see the difference between the teaching quality in subject groupings. And then the other issue we have around subject groupings is the variation in statistics, the noise that we'll see in the data. So the smaller the cohort, the greater the noise will be in terms of student satisfaction data and employment outcomes. So where you have very large cohorts, so grouping engineering as huge disciplines together, you're going to have less noise, but you're going to have less granularity on the employment outcomes in particular subject areas. So, and that makes it more difficult to look at impact for socioeconomically disadvantaged students or students from different backgrounds, different demographics, diversity, and so on. So all of this still needs kind of teasing out over the next few years. And it's going to be very difficult, I think, for universities to report on these things. And then the third element I wanted to touch on was the university and college union strikes. And this plays into various things. Now, the strikes were principally about the pensions, but actually it opened up a whole plethora of different angst and anger and lots of different things, and teaching being one of them, and the contribution that academics make to teaching not being properly recognised is certainly one of them. Very anecdotally, my wife is an academic at King's University and was on strike in her department, and she's a graduate, a PhD student, and is doing teaching, but for very low rates of pay. And so, you know, these the graduate teaching associates roles, or all these things are playing into this bigger frustration in the higher education community. So I think academics have found a voice that they haven't had for a long, long time. And I think what was interesting about the strikes was that different departments were seeing that there's anger, there's resentment in all these different departments. So I think academics are going to have a stronger voice coming forward in the years to come. So I think this is the cusp some further, not necessarily industrial action, but certainly a stronger voice from unions and academics more generally. And this then, this issue about recognition of teaching contribution in career progression is something the Academy has been working on for the last 4 years. And we started off with a survey of academics to say how important is teaching in your career progression and how much are you rewarded for your contribution to teaching. And what we found was, and I'm sure many of you will recognize this kind of shaped graph, what we have is there's a threshold on the far left-hand side below which if you don't meet that threshold, then there are kind of capability procedures or you don't get the kind of the job or so on. But once you've reached that threshold, regardless of the amount of contribution or teaching achievement you put into your work, there is very little in the way of reward for that, either in a monetary reward or career progression, until you reach some point much later on at which you become a kind of recognized national leader or global leader in education. And so what we were saying is the problem is here. So in research, there are multiple steps. So if you have large research grants, you you can get higher career progression to senior lecturer, to reader, and to professor. And we need to reflect this in teaching as well. So working with the community, with the higher education community, we've been working on introducing multiple steps to your career progression for your teaching contribution. And we've come up with this framework that you see before you here. So we have 4 distinct levels of teaching contribution, if you like. So we have, at the early stage of career, the effective teacher. And later on, a skilled and collegial teacher. Later, further, a scholarly teacher or an institutional leader. And then finally, this nationally recognized or internationally recognized leader in teaching and learning. And we're not saying at which point in a academic's career these should happen. So for some, it might be that you reach this international institutional leader as a professor, or you might just stay on this skilled and collegial teacher as a professor, as a research-intensive professor, or as a reader, and so on. That's up for the institutions to decide. What we're doing is creating a framework for which they can use. And what we're trying to do is identify these 3 questions. So what is the sphere of impact of the academic in their teaching and learning activities for each of those levels? What are the promotion criteria that define those achievements so that when they have an academic progression panel, they can present, they know what the criteria are for promotion, and then what forms of evidence can they use? And so at the effective teacher level, their sphere of impact is relatively small. It's the students, it's the outcome of their students in terms of their education. A skilled and collegial teacher has a slightly larger sphere of impact, working with their academic colleagues, so it's supporting academic colleagues in the way they're teaching and learning. And then there's a bit of a split, so you can either become an institutional leader, so working within your department, your faculty, or at your institution, or you can contribute to the canon of knowledge around education in your field. And then finally, there's this national and global education community. Okay, so the promotion criteria you can see here are listed for each of those as well. And I'm not going to go into the evidence, but I would very much encourage you to look at the teachingframework.com website. Now, importantly, this framework is for all subjects. It's not just about engineering, because we know that higher education institutions work on a much larger scale. So we've been working with universities across the world, NUS Singapore, EPFL Lausanne, MIT, Harvard, National University of NUSW Sydney, and various others. So we're really building momentum with this framework now. Okay, that's me. I'm just going to do one last thing, which is to show you the latest video of the This is Engineering campaign, which launched on Monday. This is a campaign the Academy has been running since January to encourage more young people into engineering. It's called This is Engineering, and it should play here. 90 seconds, that's all I asked for.
What I love most about engineering is the impact it has.
It's very creative and also very technical.
It's about always asking questions.
It means solving real world problems.
I like what I've made. It's going to help someone.
It's given me a lot more confidence.
Engineering can save lives.
You get to be a part of infrastructure that will serve people for years.
Best thing about engineering, we're able to make a difference.
What I love most about engineering is making the world a better place.
So, please do tweet and do social media things. We had 16 million views of the first campaign, so we want to double that before Christmas. Thank you very much.